Do you routinely log transform raw data to limit variability of high values in your antiviral assays, or in any type of assay actually? Log transformation is indeed a great tool to reduce variability of those high values, but did you ever check what it also does beyond that? If that's not the case, then this video is for you. Today, I'm going to show you what log transformation does to the data beyond reducing the variability of high values, and discuss with you the cases where it is better to use log transform data, but also the cases where raw data might be a better choice. This is actually a topic that is not very often discussed in great detail, even in big pharma, even among the many great colleagues I had before. However, I do think it's an important one to grasp because it really has an impact on the meaning of the EC50 or IC50 values which are being reported. First, it's important to remember what parameters are typically measured in assays. Today, I'm going to take the example of antiviral assays and thus viral parameters, but this is also applicable to other types of assays. So typical antiviral assays measure, for instance, the number of infectious particles produced. This is done by plaque assay, or the number of viral genomic or subgenomic copies, for instance, by qPCR or digital droplet PCR assays, or the expression level of a viral antigen is determined. For instance, in HIV-infected cultures, P24 in the supernatant can be quantified by ELISA or ligand-binding assay, or a viral antigen will be stained, followed by absorbance or fluorescence measurement or flow cytometry. Another typical type of assay is to determine the percentage of infected cells. This is done again by staining for viral antigen or viral DNA or RNA, followed by high content imaging or flow cytometry. And then also another very common type of assays is to use reporter viruses. In that case, the quantity or the enzymatic activity of the reporter protein is being measured, typically by fluorescence or luminescence. Depending on the parameter that is being measured, antiviral assays will display low, intermediate, or high signal to background ratios. So as a reminder, each antiviral assay should contain a VC or virus control. In that condition, cells and virus are added without any inhibitor, and this condition corresponds to zero inhibition of viral replication, as well as a CC or cell control. In that condition, cells only are present, no virus, no inhibitor. This condition represents a full inhibition of viral replication. The signal to background ratio is then determined by the ratio of VC over CC. So when measuring the number of infectious particles, the signal to background ratio is typically high. It is the same when measuring the number of viral genomic or subgenomic copies, as well as expression of a viral antigen followed by fluorescence or flow cytometry, or typically in a reporter assay. However, if you use ELISA to measure the expression level of viral antigen, then ELISA typically has a low dynamic range, and thus the signal to background ratio is usually around 10. Similarly, when measuring the percentage of infected cells, by definition, the maximum will be 100% infected cells, and thus the signal to background cannot go and be higher than that. So in all the antiviral assays where the signal to background ratio is high, the data is usually log transformed to limit variability, especially of the VC and the conditions where there is little inhibition of viral replication. This is great and important, but I would like you to understand that it also has other implications. To understand what log transformation does to EC50s or EC90s, we will walk through a series of cases where the signal to background ratio of the assay is either low, intermediate, or high, and either raw data or log transform data is being used. So in the first case, case 1, the signal to background ratio is low and raw data is being used for analysis. A typical assay is, for instance, infecting Jurkat cells with HIV-1 at an MY of 0.1 and adding compounds, 5 days later harvesting the supernatant and measuring P24 by ELISA. The analysis will look like this. So the OD of the CC wells will correspond to 100% inhibition, the OD of the VC wells to 0% inhibition. And then the data is directly used to calculate absolute or relative EC50 or EC90 as the concentration yielding 50 or 90% inhibition. In that case, a typical OD for VC wells will be around 1, while a typical OD for CC wells without virus will be around 0.1. As a reminder, the percentage of inhibition of viral replication is calculated as follows. It is 100 times the ratio ODVC minus OD sample divided by ODVC minus ODCC. So in our case, it will be 100 times 1 minus OD sample divided by 1 minus 0.1. And thus, the absolute EC50 corresponds to a reduction of 0.45 OD and thus a remaining replication of 0.55 ODs, while the absolute EC90 corresponds to a reduction of 0.81 OD and a remaining replication of 0.19. Now moving to case 2 and log transformation of the data. So it's the exact same assay as before, but the data is first log transformed before being used. So that means for the analysis that the log 10 of the OD of CC wells will be defined as 100% inhibition, and the log 10 of the OD of VC wells will be considered as 0% inhibition. The calculation of the absolute EC50 or EC90s is the exact same as before. So in our case now, the log 10 of the OD of VC wells will be around 0, while the log 10 of the OD of CC wells will be around -1. I do realize this is a theoretical example because log transformation is not typically used for ELISA, but I do want to show you the impact of a log transformation. So please bear with me. Now, the absolute EC50 corresponds to a level of remaining replication of minus 0.5 log 10 OD. So by calculating to actually a remaining replication level of 0.32 OD. So 0.32 instead of 0.55 using the raw data, while the absolute EC90 corresponds to a remaining level of replication of minus 0.9 log 10 OD, and by calculating to 0.13 OD. So you can realize that the log transformation results in a slightly more stringent efficacy measure, especially for the EC50, compared to using the raw data. Now moving to case 3, where the signal to background ratio is intermediate and raw data is used for analysis. So a typical assay would be infecting a 549 human ACE2 human TMPRSS2 cells with SARS-CoV-2, adding compound, and 1 day later staining the cells for viral nucleoprotein or RNA and performing high content imaging. There, the analysis is a bit more complex and occurs in 3 steps. So in step 1, the MFI plus 3 times the standard deviation of CC wells is used to derive a threshold for a cell to be considered infected or not. In step 2, for each well, control or sample, the threshold is used to calculate, on one hand, the number of infected cells, and on the other hand, the total number of cells is measured. And both are used to derive the percentage of infected cells in the particular well. In step 3, the percentage of infected cells of the CC wells is used to define 100% inhibition, while that of VC wells is used to define 0% inhibition. And then similarly as before, these values are used to calculate absolute EC50s or EC90s. In such an example, typically not all cells are infected. So in the VC wells, in the particular example, we could measure maximally 70% of infected cells, and this corresponded to 0% inhibition. While for the CC wells at the bottom, around 1% infected cells was typically measured, and this corresponded to 100% inhibition. In that case, the absolute EC50 corresponds to a level of 35% infected cells, while the absolute EC90 corresponds to a level of 7% infected. If now the data is first log transformed in case 4, so exact same assay as in case 3, but during the analysis at step 3, 100% inhibition is defined by the log 10 of the percentage of infected cells in the CC wells, while 0% inhibition is calculated with the log 10 of the percentage of infected cells in the VC wells. Now, the 70% infected cells in the VC wells on top correspond to a log value of 1.85 and are thus defined as 0% inhibition, while at the bottom, the CC wells and 1% infected cells corresponds to a log value of 0 and are defined as 100% inhibition. Using this, the absolute EC50 now corresponds to a log value of 0.92, sorry, and thus 8.4% infected cells if you back calculate, while the absolute EC90 corresponds to a 0.185 log and back calculating 1.5% infected cells. So 8.4 and 1.5. If you now remember case 3, the absolute EC50 corresponded to 35% infected cells. So 35 versus here 8.4 with the log transform data. Similarly for the EC90, it was 7% using the raw data, while it is 1.5% using the log transform data. So you can appreciate that here again, and even more than in case 1 and 2, the log transformation results in a more stringent efficacy measure compared to using the raw data. Now moving to case 5, where the signal to background ratio is certainly high and raw data is used for analysis. A typical example would be infecting Vero human TMPRSS2 cells with SARS-CoV-2 at an MOI of 0.1, adding compounds, and 3 days later, performing a plaque assay on the supernatant. For analysis, the viral titer of the CC wells will correspond to 100% inhibition, while that of the VC wells will correspond to 0% inhibition. Again, absolute EC50 or EC90s are being calculated as before. Now, SARS-CoV-2 replicates a lot also in vitro, and a typical viral titer in VC wells would be around 10 to the 8 PFU per ml, while for the CC wells, it will be defined by the LLOQ of the assay, typically 10 to the second PFU per ml in our hands. Now, the absolute EC50 will correspond to a level of 5 10 to the 7 PFU per ml, while the absolute EC90 will correspond to a level of 1 10 to the 7 PFU per ml. I'm sure you can appreciate that this is still a lot of infectious variants present in the sample. Now, with such high VC values, the data is typically log transformed, and this is what we see in case 6. So here, same assay as before in case 5, but for analysis, the log 10 of the viral titer of CC wells will be defined as 100% inhibition, while the log 10 of the viral titer of the VC wells will be defined as 0% inhibition. And in our previous example, then the VC wells will have a value, so a log 10 of viral titer around 8, while the CC wells will have a value around 2. Now, the absolute EC50 corresponds to a level of 5 log, or 10 to the 5 PFU per ml, while the absolute EC90 corresponds to a level of 2.6 log, or 10 to the power 2.6 PFU per ml. So 10 to the 5, 10 to 2.6. If you remember case 5, there the EC50 was corresponding to a level of 5 10 to the 7, while here log transform 10 to the 5. And for the EC90, even more striking, using the raw data, it was a level of 10 to the 7, while now using log transform data, it is a level of 10 to the power 2.6. So here again, and even more now, log transformation clearly results in a much more stringent efficacy measure compared to using raw data. Moving to the last two cases, so case 7 and 8, I would like to show you a reporter assay. So in case 7, we use the raw data for analysis. A typical example would be infecting a 509 human ACE2 human TMPRSS2 cells with a SARS-CoV-2 virus harboring a reporter gene, so here a nanoluciferase, and 1 day later measuring luminescence. For analysis, the mean RLU of the CC wells will define the 100% inhibition level, while the mean RLU of the VC wells will correspond to 0% inhibition. In such an assay, a typical mean RLU of VC wells is around 100,000, while a typical mean RLU of CC wells is around 100. With that, the absolute EC50 will correspond to a mean RLU of 50,050, and the absolute EC90 will correspond to a mean RLU of 10,090. Now, what does it really mean biologically to measure a mean RLU of 50,050 or 10,090? Reporter assays are easy to perform and highly sensitive, which is obviously great, but their biological interpretation can be more complex than other assays because of the signal amplification of the reporter gene. If now we use log transform data in case 8 instead of raw data in case 7, the analysis will look like this. So the log10 of the mean RLU of CC wells will define 100% inhibition, while the log10 of the mean RLU of the VC wells will define 0% inhibition. And thus, the value for the VC wells will be around 5, while the value for the CC wells will be around 2. And thus, the absolute EC50 will correspond to around 4.5 log, and back calculating to a mean RLU of 15,850, while the absolute EC90 will correspond to 3.3 log and a mean RLU back calculating of around 2,000. So 15,850 and 2,000. If now you remember the values for case 7, it was for EC50, 50,000. So 50,000 raw data, 15,850 log transform data. And for the EC90, it was using the raw data in case 7 around 10,000, while now it is around 2,000. So once more, this shows that log transformation results in a much more stringent efficacy measure compared to using the raw data. Of course, the remark about the biological meaning of a reporter assay remains. After these 8 cases, I hope I have convinced you that log transforming the data does result in a lower variability, but also results in a more stringent efficacy measure than the raw data. And actually, the higher the signal to background ratio, the more stringent the efficacy measure. I also hope I've convinced you to not forget to understand the true biological meaning of the parameter that you are measuring. So, with such a difference in stringency between using raw data or log transform data, what is the best choice? To answer that question, you need to ask yourself what the ultimate goal of your antiviral assay is. What is the ultimate goal for you in your particular context of measuring EC50 or EC90 of the compounds you are studying? Is it on one hand to discover the most potent compound, the most potent drug? If that is the case, please remember that in vivo or in the clinic, viral load is typically measured and log transformed. And in that case, a viral load drop of less than 1 log is actually considered as background variability. If that is the case, then definitely use log transformation. On the other hand, if you are earlier in your program and want to discover hits during a high throughput screening campaign, please remember that hits are typically not very potent compounds yet. They are not optimized, and so you don't want to be too stringent, or you will just drop everything in that case. So, in that case, do use raw data. That's actually the only case where I would truly recommend to use raw data, unless you are using ELISA or percentage of infected cells. Finally, please adapt in function of the biological meaning of the parameter that you measure. And very important, please do report precisely the analysis methods you used in the material and method section of your publications. So please report whether you are using raw data or log transform data. One final point. Here I've mainly talked about absolute EC50s and EC90s, but the considerations are certainly true for relative EC50s and EC90s. To conclude, I'm actually curious if these concepts were already familiar to you and if you were aware of the impact of log transformation on the stringency of the antiviral assays or any type of assay, and if these concepts were already discussed in your previous professional experiences. If that's the case, do leave a comment below. Thank you, bye bye.